All right, welcome back. This is Unit 4, Video 1. We are getting into the eve of war. The Revolutionary War is about to start, so let's pick up after the Boston Massacre. All right, remember that was where Paul Revere did his silver engraving of the Boston Massacre, that whole scenario. So after the Boston Massacre, tensions relaxed in the colonies. The calm, however, was merely just the eye of the storm. And in June 1772, an armed British customs ship called the Gaspee ran aground near Providence, Rhode Island. And the ship's captain, who had previously searched ships without a warrant and had sent his crew ashore to just take food without paying for it, was not welcomed in Rhode Island. And on the night of June 9th, the local citizens boarded the Gaspee and captured and removed the crew, and they burned the ship. This attack on one of His Majesty's ships prompted the British to send a commission to investigate and make arrests. In the past, such matters would have been handled by the colonial courts. At the same time, the Massachusetts governor announced that his salary would now come from the king and not the colony. No longer would the legislature be able to limit the governor or other royal officials by using the power of the purse. More and more, the colonists came to believe that their rights were being stripped away. Another development in 1772 furthered this belief. In November, the Boston Town Meeting authorized the formation of a Committee of Correspondence. And under the guidance of Samuel Adams, the committee provided information on British threats to liberty to other areas of the colony. So the Boston Committee also successfully encouraged the formation of a network of committee of correspondence within the colonies. So within 3 months, 80 new committees had formed in Massachusetts alone. And in March 1773, the Virginia legislature voted to establish a permanent committee of correspondence, and other colonies quickly followed. So the Committee of Correspondence and other colonies um, provided not only information, but also modeled intercolonial cooperation that would be an important step toward a united political and military response to the British actions. So we see them unifying, and then we have the Boston Tea Party. This is probably one of the most famous events of the war, and I'm sure you have some knowledge of it, but let's just make sure our details are right about it. So the East India Company had been one of the most profitable businesses in Britain, but the company was facing a crisis. Its warehouses were stuffed with 17 million pounds of tea, and the company was verging on bankruptcy. And so the company turned to its powerful friends for help. At the urging of the Prime Minister, Lord North, Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773, which basically granted the East India Company a monopoly on the shipment and sale of English tea in America. The British tea was still cheaper to buy than the smuggled Dutch tea. However, the colonists were enraged by this monopolization and lack of choice. So, if Parliament could grant a monopoly on tea, what was next? In port cities from Boston to Charleston, opposition to the tea shipments was intense. In New York and Philadelphia, for example, tea agents resigned and sea captains returned their cargo home to England for fear of their lives and property. Tea, like the hated stamp nearly a decade earlier, now became a symbol of tyranny. Tea, so tea was then replaced with coffee. Coffee replaced the British beverage on Patriot tables. And that began America's love for coffee. So, when the tea arrived in Boston Harbor aboard the Dartmouth on November 28, 1773, Patriots made every effort to have it returned to England. The governor, though, refused to allow the ships to return, and the confrontation kind of became a stalemate. So the Patriots were determined that this tea would not be unloaded in the Boston port, and the governor was determined that it would be. So, on the eve of December 16th, 1773, thousands gathered from the Boston town meeting in the Old South Church, not far from the waterfront. Shortly afterwards, the shouts of "Boston Harbor, a teapot tonight" approximately came from around 150 men and boys who crudely disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians and boarded the Dartmouth and two other newly arrived tea ships. So in the Boston Tea Party, the group dumped 342 large cases of tea into the harbor in under 3 hours. To clarify the purpose of this protest, the raiders took great care to avoid damaging anything except the tea. Even a broken padlock was anonymously replaced the next day. Only one man was caught stealing tea, and he was promptly kicked off the ship. When the ships had been emptied of tea, the the participants cleaned them and released their crews. So the Patriots then lined up at attention on deck, emptied any loose tea from their boots, swept it into the harbor, and marched away singing, "Rally Mohawks, bring out your axes, and tell King George we'll pay no taxes on his foreign tea." Even pro-British colonists or loyalists admitted that the Tea Party had been conducted as correctly as a crime could be. Across the Atlantic, however, the incident was not regarded lightly. And so King George instructed Lord North, the Prime Minister, that it was time for strong measures against the colonies. So the colonies must either submit or triumph, the king declared. On this, at least, the Patriots and the king were in agreement. Ooh, submit or triumph. We see it escalating. So, what happens after the Boston Tea Party? What is this submit or triumph? Well, the Boston Tea Party spurred the British government into action against Massachusetts specifically. And in 1774, Parliament passed four acts known together collectively as the Coercive Acts. And they were intended to punish the troublesome colony. So the first act closed the harbor, effective June 1st, 1774, until the cost of all the destroyed tea was repaid. Obviously, it was a monumental amount that wasn't going to happen. The second act revoked the Massachusetts Colonial Charter. Now officials would be appointed by the royal governor rather than elected in town meetings. And town meetings were only allowed under governor approval. So they're taking away their autonomy to govern. The third act dictated that British officials accused of committing crimes be tried not in Massachusetts, but in another colony or in England. And then there was a new quartering act. The fourth act required the housing and feeding of British soldiers in private homes. With the arrival of the military governor, General Thomas Gage, to replace the existing governor, Bostonians knew that their city was under military occupation. If colonial submission was the purpose behind the coercive acts, it was a clear failure. In America, these measures called the intolerable acts. So the intolerable acts and the coercive acts are the same thing, okay? Intolerable acts are synonymous with coercive acts. So the intolerable acts, by what the Patriots called them, um, this they basically hardened when Britain did the intolerable acts, they hardened their opposition and created an unprecedented sense of unity among the colonies. And this is where the Committee of Correspondence really kicked in because you had Boston under military siege. And so the Committee of Correspondence was telling all the rest of the colonies what was happening in Boston. And then the Committee of Correspondence was the only way that Boston was getting any reports about what was happening elsewhere in the colonies. And so there was a sense of unity against the British at this point. And then, just to top it all off, in addition, Parliament passed the Quebec Act, which was directed at British Canada, not the 13 colonies. But the timing, however, literally could not have been worse. The Quebec Act set up a rigid political system, made Roman Catholicism the official religion of Quebec, and extended the territorial bounds of the Quebec's southernwards towards the Ohio River. So this just was like, see, look what they're doing with their power. They did it in Quebec. Um, this enraged many Americans, and Protestants in Quebec had to flee Catholic persecution um, in Europe, and so this started to happen in Quebec, and it just, even though it didn't really have anything to do with them, to them it was an example of how the British Empire abused their power. So. I just want you to know the details of the First Continental Congress, and then we're going to be set for today. So, the Committee of Correspondence is all about mail and communication. Now, remember, this First Continental Congress is all about the governing aspect. So, sympathy for Boston spread throughout the colonies. And in the House of Burgesses, which is in Williamsburg, Virginia, it's one of the oldest government entities in America. You can still go visit it today. A 31-year-old Virginian named Thomas Jefferson called for a day of fasting and prayer as a show of support for Boston patriots. The royal governor, upon hearing of this resolution, tried to dissolve the House. But they were unperturbed, didn't stop them. The legislators simply reconvened in a nearby restaurant, where they adopted a resolution calling for the meeting of a Continental Congress. Similar calls came from all the other colonies. The Massachusetts House of Representatives called for the Colonial Committees of Correspondence to meet in Philadelphia in September. And on September 5th, representatives from all the colonies, except Georgia, gathered in the Philadelphia's Carpenter Hall for the First Continental Congress. And far from being a gathering of radicals, the 55 delegates had been elected by their colonial assemblies or by the provinces that they were from. And including some of the most distinguished characters that were there, we have George Washington and Patrick Henry of Virginia, as well as John Adams and Samuel Adams of Massachusetts. The changing times required new thinking, and the delegates showed themselves equal to the task. The geographic and historical features that divided the colonies had to give way to united thinking. Patrick Henry declared the distinctions between Virginian, Pennsylvanian, and New Yorkers and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian. I am an American. And that was the essence of the spirit of cooperation that was existing among the delegates. When one member proposed that the sessions open with prayer, the idea was at first opposed on the ground that Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Quakers, Anglicans, and Mennonites, all represented among the delegates, could not possibly worship together. But Samuel Adams, who as a young man had sat under the preachings of George Whitefield, favored the prayer proposal and declared that his faith did not prevent him from hearing anyone pray as long as that man was devout in his religious beliefs and a patriot and was praying towards God. The other delegates conceded the point, and the next day an Anglican pastor arrived. During the night, word reached the city that General Gage's troops had opened fire on civilians in Boston. In light of the tragedy in Boston, the minister read Psalm 35, 1 through 2. Plead my cause, O Lord, with them that strive with me. Fight against them that fight against me. Take hold of shield and buckler, and stand up for mine help. Then he prayed powerfully for 10 minutes for the people of Boston. And when he had finished, the assembly was visibly moved, and many delegates wept openly. Although the report of Boston casualties proved to be actually false, there actually were no deaths, but there was just miscommunication. Gage had actually just confiscated a stock of Patriot gunpowder but there actually weren't deaths, the delegates proceeded with business. They adopted a Declaration of American Rights that stated that colonies must be self-governing in nearly every respect. Although they maintained their allegiance to the king, they asserted that his actions had to be consistent with American rights. As self-governing states, the colonies had the right to raise militias to defend themselves. After 7 weeks of work, the delegates agreed to reconvene the Congress in May of 1775. None of them would be able to foresee that by then the course of events would have decidedly taken a bloody turn. And that is where we will end today. We will pick up with the shot heard round the world in the next video. I'll see you guys later.